I'm delighted to welcome this afternoon Dr. Ian Crozier from Christchurch Hospital in New Zealand, who's one of the clinical cardiologists on the faculty there. Thanks very much for joining us on this episode of Left to Our Own Devices, Dr. Crozier.
Well, thank you very much, Oliver, for the opportunity to talk with you today about the extravascular implantable defibrillator.
Absolutely. So it would be right and proper to start with a thumbnail sketch of how such a remarkably different piece of technology came about. So I wondered if you'd take us through that.
Well, the extravascular defibrillator has been in development for over 10 years. The concept was first developed by Amy Thompson, who is an engineer. She works with Medtronic. And in 2011, the idea came to her, but she was at that stage on maternity leave, so she didn't have the opportunity to work on the project until 2012. At that stage, they were addressing how they could deliver defibrillator therapy without leads inside the heart, but also improve on the subcutaneous defibrillator. And she had the inspiration that simply taking the lead and placing it under rather than over the sternum would give significant advantages. It would lower the energy required for defibrillation, which in turn would allow for a smaller, longer-lasting device, but also it would give the potential to pace the heart, both for antitachycardia pacing and for backup pacing. So she started working on this in 2012. She initially worked with animal models. They were able to show that they could place the lead under the heart and that they could pace and defibrillate the heart. And then they embarked on a series of proof of concept studies in humans. They were called the ASD and the SPACE study, and then the ASD2 study. And these were a series of studies where patients that were undergoing either cardiac surgery or conventional defibrillator implants had leads placed under the sternum to assess whether the heart could be defibrillated, sensed, or paced. The most important of these studies was the ASD2 study, the acute substernal defibrillation study. In this study, 79 patients who were either undergoing cardiac surgery or device implantation had the lead that we now use, this epsilon-shaped lead, placed under the sternum, and we were able to assess defibrillation, sensing, and pacing. The leads were then removed, and then the procedure completed. So these were purely done as proof of concept studies. This showed that the concept was viable, that we could defibrillate the heart at energies comparable to a transvenous device, and that we could sense and pace the heart. It also allowed us to collect electrograms, which we could then, the algorithms for the detection algorithms were detected. And finally, it gave us insights as to how we should inform the implant procedure. So that was the preparation or the work that was done prior to the very first human implants. And the very first human implants were performed in 2018 in the pilot study.
Absolutely. Remarkable development, really, and really changing the paradigm for defibrillators and our understanding of them. And so the pilot study then led through to the pivotal trial, which I know that you were critically at the center of. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about the results of that pivotal trial and how it led to the market release.
So the pivotal study was the worldwide evaluation of this device. This was conducted between late 2019 and 2021. It was performed in multiple sites in multiple countries, multiple investigators. We recruited 356 patients, 316 underwent attempted implant. Of those patients, 299 left the lab and left the hospital with a working device. In only one patient could the lead not be placed. And only 4 patients failed defibrillation. Now, there were a number of other patients that did not have the device left in place, 7 of them because they did not have adequate sensing, 4 couldn't complete the protocol. So 299 patients had their device implanted and left the hospital with implanted devices. And we now have good data on the efficacy of defibrillation, on the safety of the device, and the long-term performance of the device. And we recently published the data on the 3-year follow-up for these patients.
That's great. You know, I think you touched there briefly on the safety of the device. Maybe we could unpack that a little more. You know, the retrosternal space is not somewhere that as electrophysiologists we're super familiar with being in. In terms of the safety of the implant, how have things developed and where are we now with that?
I think this is a very interesting and important question. And you're absolutely right. Electrophysiologists don't normally go behind the sternum. So not only is this a novel device, but it's a completely novel implant procedure. And the key steps that are novel for electrophysiologists is retrosternal access and retrosternal tunneling and placing the lead behind the sternum. And this is not without potential risk. There's no question about it that there is a potential for cardiac injury. Indeed, we did have a major cardiac injury in the ASD2 trial that we halted the program at that stage. We reevaluated how we should do the implant, and we now have really good guidance on how the implant can be done and minimize risk of cardiac injury. So we were really delighted by the safety that we experienced in the pivotal trial. So we looked at, first of all, one of the key endpoints, the safety endpoint for the pivotal trial was freedom from adverse device or procedure-related complications out to 6 months. Our freedom from complications was 92.6%. And so that complication rate is no higher than you would expect with a transvenous defibrillator. But it's dependent on physicians being trained to work in this space. And so there are key safety steps to the implant, and it's really important that moving forward, we maintain the safety record, which is going to require training of physicians working in this new site. And we should not think that this is a procedure without risk, so we need to be planned for and prepared for potential complications as well.
Even though the rate of complications wasn't especially different from contemporary standard ICD implantation, were the nature of the complications different that we experienced?
They were different, and to be honest, as a general rule, the complications we saw were relatively minor. So the majority of the complications were lead dislodgements, and that relates to suturing the lead in. Because this is a loose fascial space, nothing holds the lead in apart from the sutures at the time of implant. So it's really important to suture the lead in correctly. Importantly, in the pivotal trial, there was no major cardiac injury, nor were there any unique complications related to the procedure. So in fact, provided patients are careful and follow the safety steps for the implant, I believe this procedure can be done with a good safety record.
Absolutely. And what about its efficacy as a device? Of course, you know, modern day transvenous ICDs are incredibly efficient, both in terms of their ATP success rates and the defibrillation success rates. How does the EV-ICD perform in the contemporary trials, you know, relative to what we have already?
Thank you very much. So we can answer that, first of all, with the acute testing that was done at the time of implant in the pivotal trial, where to complete the trial, the patients had to defibrillate with a 10 joule safety margin. And we achieved an efficacy of 98.7%. So of the 316 patients that had an attempted implant, only 4 patients failed defibrillation testing. So that's a very high acute defibrillation efficacy. It's actually higher than is seen with transvenous devices. If you look at the SIMPLE trial, for instance, the efficacy was 92% for defibrillation testing with a 10-joule safety margin. In addition to that, we now have the 3-year follow-up data from the pivotal trial, so we know the efficacy for spontaneous arrhythmias. So on the patients in the pivotal trial, 9.2% of patients received therapy for spontaneous arrhythmias. In those 24 patients, there were 82 episodes that had therapy, and they were roughly split between shock therapy and ATP therapy. So of all the patients, all the events that had shocks, that's 27 events, all were converted successfully. And we've also now got data on ATP as well. So this device, in addition to shock therapy, has anti-tachycardia pacing, so that sets it aside from the subcutaneous device. In 48 episodes, ATP was applied. It was successful in 37 episodes, so that ATP success is 77%. That is comparable to the success of anti-tachycardia pacing with transvenous devices, and the slide shows an example of anti-tachycardia pacing with the extravascular defibrillator. Importantly, that meant that shocks were avoided in 10 patients. So this is important for patients in terms of patient comfort. One of the concerns about the extravascular defibrillator is that patients perceive pacing. So if you check pacing in clinic, they can perceive it anywhere from a mild sensation to quite significant discomfort. But for clinical pacing, pacing with anti-tachycardia therapy, in fact, it's very well tolerated. So the ATP was well tolerated. Patients did not complain of major discomfort. And so no patient asked for ATP to be turned off following successful ATP. And as clinicians became more comfortable with using ATP in this device, we saw a significant increase in programming on of ATP from 68 to 81%. And certainly in my patients, I program on ATP in all my patients with the extravascular defibrillator.
That's extremely reassuring. That is something that I do hear people raise concerns about. So that's extremely reassuring. How about inappropriate therapy? Of course, you know, we're sensing in an unusual space here, the lead being substernal. What do we know about the rates of inappropriate therapies with the EV-ICD?
Well, again, we've got data both from the acute data and now the 3-year follow-up data from the pivotal trial. And we would certainly acknowledge initially our inappropriate shock rate was high, particularly in the first half of the pivotal trial. And if we look at the total pivotal group, the inappropriate shock rate was 9.8% in the first year, the majority of those events occurring early on. What we are seeing now is that the new patients with inappropriate shock rate, the rate is now falling in subsequent years, and it's approximately an additional 4% of patients a year who get inappropriate shocks. We've learned a lot about why patients with the extravascular defibrillator get inappropriate shocks, and we've learned how to reduce that risk. The major cause, or one of the main causes for inappropriate shocks with the extravascular defibrillator, is oversensing of the P wave. So we now know at the implant it's very important to minimize or completely avoid P wave sensing. And so by changing the guidance for implants, we've already seen a reduction in inappropriate shocks. Furthermore, we now know how to program the device to avoid P-wave oversensing. So with this improved implant technique, improved programming, we're seeing a drop in the inappropriate shock rate. And finally, for the commercial device, there is also a specific P-wave oversensing algorithm, which we predict will further reduce inappropriate shocks. So although at this stage our inappropriate shock rate is higher than for the subcutaneous and transvenous devices, we see a trend that the inappropriate shock rate is falling. And of course, it's worth remembering with the first transvenous defibrillators, we had a high inappropriate shock rate. We learned how to reduce that shock rate. Likewise, with the subcutaneous defibrillators, our initial experience was we had a high inappropriate shock rate, and we've learned how to reduce that inappropriate shock rate as well. So I believe with time, we will reduce the inappropriate shock rate with the extravascular defibrillator down to the rate we would see with transvenous and subcutaneous devices.
That's reassuring data for sure. And you touched on the fact that having the lead in that substernal space allows not only for ATP, but also for the ability to perform pause prevention pacing. What has been your experience with that particular feature of the EV-ICD?
So the extravascular defibrillator also has backup pacing. It's got post-shock and also pause prevention pacing. Now, our experience is limited because the need for a pacemaker is a contraindication to the extravascular defibrillator. It is not designed to provide chronic or permanent pacing, but it does have this pause prevention pacing, which following a pause of at least 5 seconds will provide pacing at 40 beats a minute for 30 seconds. So it's rescue pacing. It will prevent a patient dying if they've developed catastrophic heart block. They pace for 30 seconds and it checks again. You have to have another pause for at least 5 seconds before the pacing will keep on reiterating. And so because the patients that needed pacing were contraindicated from the trial, we've only got a handful of patients that have used pause prevention pacing, 3 in the pivotal trial, but also 1 in the pilot trial. And the 1 in the pilot trial is a patient of mine. He does not have heart block, but he gets intermittent sinus bradycardia, probably triggered because he has sleep apnea, and also probably because there's a vagal component as well. He gets swallow sinus bradycardia. And he's now had pause prevention pacing that's been effective for 5 years. Over 5 years, he's had 80 episodes of pause prevention pacing. He tolerates it very well. We've not had to upgrade him to a permanent pacemaker.
That's great. So putting all that together, who would you say is the ideal patient for an EV-ICD? You know, we've got transvenous ICDs, we've got the subcutaneous ICD, we've had both of those for quite a while. Aside from its novelty, who do you think that physicians watching this should be really trying to target with this novel technology?
Well, I would say it's simpler to say who is not suitable for it. And then I would if there's not a contraindication to the device, consider this device in the majority of my defibrillator implants. So who is not suitable? We do not recommend the device if the patient has had prior cardiac surgery. Prior cardiac surgery obliterates the retrosternal space and would make dissection into that space risky with an increased risk of cardiac injury. It's also not recommended for patients that have a chronic pacing indication because it's not designed to be a permanent pacemaker. It can be combined with a single chamber bipolar pacemaker, but it cannot be combined with multi-chamber pacing or a unipolar pacemaker. So beyond that, it's really suitable for all patients. Of course, we don't have data in the pediatric age group, but then we don't have data in the pediatric age group for subcutaneous or transvenous defibrillators as well. So absolutely. I consider it in all patients that need a defibrillator, provided they don't have those contraindications. The patients I particularly target are patients where there is a significant risk associated with a transvenous defibrillator, or a reason why they cannot have a transvenous defibrillator, such as if they have vascular access, or they are high risk of infection, such as patients with renal failure or prior infected devices. And the other group that I particularly target are younger patients. I know if I implant a transvenous defibrillator in a young patient who's going to live decades, that they're at very high risk of major lead-related morbidity, and more likely than not, they'll have a major lead-related complication and may require extraction in the long term. So I try to keep out of the vascular space in young patients. And so a young person that needs a defibrillator, my defibrillator of choice is the extravascular defibrillator, provided they have not got a major contraindication. That's prior cardiac surgery or the need for a permanent pacemaker.
That's really helpful. Leads me nicely into the next question. What do we know about extracting the EV-ICD lead in patients who have needed that? Have there been cases where these leads have been extracted, and what advice would you give to people who face that situation?
That's a very important question, because obviously we are concerned about lead extraction in patients with transvenous devices. We know with the subcutaneous device, it's low risk to extract leads. What's the situation with the extravascular defibrillator? Well, we have to acknowledge we only have limited experience so far. So we don't have very, very long-term data. We do know that the space is a very loose avascular space. And so that fibrosis is unlikely to occur in the retrosternal space, but fibrosis can occur through the rectus sheath where the lead is tunneled. And we do have a good volume of experience, albeit relatively short-term dwell times. So leads have now been taken out in 29 patients. In 10 of those, the leads were implanted for more than 1 year. In the vast majority of patients, the leads were able to be removed by simple manual traction. In a very small percentage of patients, tools were required. In 2 patients, the leads were not able to be extracted. So if we look at the lead, it's a very robust lead. It doesn't have a lumen. And so the break strain of the lead is something like 10 kgs, and the lead doesn't stretch. And I've taken out a number of leads now, and my approach is to dissect out through the rectus sheath, and then just using manual traction, I've been able to take out all the leads that I've taken out. So it's looking promising at this stage that extraction is not going to be high risk. It's going to be straightforward, but we still don't have the data beyond the initial first few years.
The position of binding of that lead when you've tried to remove it has been predominantly
almost
diaphragmatic attachments?
Yeah,
Or
almost always in the rectus sheath, the diaphragmatic attachments. Any adhesions beyond there appear to be minor and easily broken just by simple manual traction.
Dr. Crozier, what 3 key lessons would you say that you've learned about the use of the EV-ICD in the real world?
Oh, well, thank you very much. We've learnt a lot as we've worked our way through this program. I think the key ones, I think the first one would be the variation anatomy and the role of a CT scan in planning your procedure. So I rely on CT scans. I study them carefully before I consent a patient, and I study them carefully before I do an implant. And the variation in anatomy is remarkable. The relationship of the heart to the sternum is very variable. It can be relatively low compared with the sternum or much higher. The depth of the space between the sternum and the heart can be very variable. Initially, when I did implants, I thought a big space was good and that I should be concerned about a narrow or absent space, but there's always a fascial plane there. And in fact, having a narrow space, in my opinion, facilitates the procedure because the lead sits very well and you get very good electrical performance. The lungs often kiss or join together in the midline, and that influences where you tunnel to, and that kissing point can vary anywhere between the right-hand side of the sternum to beyond the left-hand side of the sternum. And finally, in a significant percentage of patients, the right atrial appendage extends behind the sternum, and that can result in P-wave oversensing. But knowing where the right atrial appendage is, you can tunnel to avoid the right atrial appendage. So using the CT scan, understanding the variation anatomy, is a key part to doing the implant and designing the implant. So that's one thing that I've learned throughout this. The second important thing we've learned as we've moved.
Can I ask you about your approach to CT scans? Do you insist on having a CT scan for every case?
Well,
and if you do,
I would always have a CT scan. It doesn't have to be a recent CT scan. It could have been done some time ago, but I personally would not do an implant without having a CT scan.
And is there for the inexperienced implanter, is there an appearance or something on a CT scan that you would see that would dissuade you from attempting the implantation of an EV-ICD?
Very well, the only thing that would stop me doing an implant would be a significant pectus excavatum. All the other issues, which we commonly see, where, for instance, the lung kissed together and there's only a virtual space between the lungs, or a prominent right atrial appendage, they do not stop you doing an implant. They just alter the way you do the implant and where you tunnel. It's just knowing that can influence how you tunnel and where you position the lead. Wonderful.
I interrupted you. You were saying your second key lesson.
So the second thing I've learned is about sensing. So when we first did the implants, we put the lead behind the sternum and pretty well accepted whatever sensing we got. What we now know is that if we get the best sensing at the time of implant, in other words, the largest R wave possible and little or no P wave, then we'll optimize the performance of the device and reduce the risk of inappropriate shocks. So I now spend quite a bit of time, once I've implanted the lead, I actually map the sensing behind the sternum. I start with my lead high, and then I pull it down in very small steps, just a millimeter or two. It's remarkable how much a millimeter's movement will change the sensing, and I try to get the very best R wave possible. The device will work with an R wave of 1 millivolt, and so the recommendation is you have at least 1 millivolt throughout the cardiac cycle, but the larger the R wave, the better. The mean R wave in the pivotal trial was 2.6. I try to get a R wave of 2.6 or more in every patient, even if that means retunneling. So I try to optimize sensing. That will then optimize device performance. And finally, the final thing I've learned through the study is how much the patients like this device. They may have postoperative discomfort, but once they're over that period, patient acceptance is very high. Patient comfort is good. It's much more comfortable than the subcutaneous device. Indeed, we did a quality of life study, and we used historic controls with the subcutaneous device, and patient acceptance was very much better than with the subcutaneous device. So patients who get the extravascular device really like the device. They appreciate the size. They appreciate that it's cosmetically attractive, that it can provide ATP and so can avoid shock therapy. So patient acceptance of the device has been excellent as well.
How does the size of the device vary compared to the subcutaneous ICD? And does the position of the device on the side of the patient, is that different?
So we position the device not as posterior as the subcutaneous device, and we do not put the device submuscular. There is good reason why we position the device in the middle of the left chest wall rather than on the posterior chest wall as we would with the subcutaneous device. And that relates to the work we've done with modeling of defibrillation. So because the lead is under rather than over the sternum, that alters the optimal point for the device placement for defibrillation. So for the extravascular device, it is in the mid side of the left chest wall, whereas for the subcutaneous device, it's much more in a posterior position to optimize defibrillation. So it's a different position from the subcutaneous device.
That's wonderful. Well, Dr. Crozier, thanks very much indeed for sharing those gems with us and for talking to us today. I'm really excited that we've got something new to offer patients, something that's outside of the vascular space, and it seems clear from this initial data that the EV-ICD is going to be a long-standing, great addition to our armamentarium for ICDs moving forward. Thanks for joining us.
And can I make one final comment?
Yes, sir.
Again, if I'm going to go back to that young patient who needs a defibrillator, sure, it's easy if you just want to make life easy for yourself. You put in a transvenous defibrillator, they go away. It's a bit more bother to put in the extravascular device. You have to have an anesthetist. You need surgical backup. The procedure can be a little bit fiddly at times. But if we're thinking about what is best, not for us, but for the patient, avoiding this vascular space in young patients, avoiding transvenous device, I think is absolutely critical for the patient. So it's worth going to that extra bother to put in the extravascular defibrillator.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks again, sir.